Tonight, a pinpoint of light glides through the constellations above your house. You might mistake it for an airplane, but it makes no sound. It is a satellite, one of thousands that connect your phone, predict your weather, and watch over the planet. You probably think this Quiet Sentinel was born from a scientist's dream. But the rocket that launched the very first one had a much darker purpose. It was built to deliver a 5-ton hydrogen bomb onto American soil. And the journey from weapon to star-reaching craft took just 44 days. That brief window is the hinge upon which your modern world swings, and it nearly closed the other way. In the early 1950s, the world you know barely existed. Two superpowers stared at each other across a sea of nuclear fire. Your grandparents huddled under school desks during bomb drills. That was not paranoia. Just a few years earlier, atomic bombs had erased Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Cold War was not a distant abstract threat, but a daily knot in your stomach. Now both sides were racing to build a missile that could cross oceans in minutes. Whichever nation succeeded would hold a loaded gun to every city on the enemy's map. The project inside the Soviet Union had a code name, R7. It was a towering beast of a machine. A man named Sergei Korolev ran the design bureau. He had spent years in a Soviet prison camp, accused of sabotage. His jaw had been broken during interrogation, yet here he was, tasked with creating the most terrifying weapon in human history. Korolev was a dreamer. Long before the R-7, he had scribbled designs for a rocket that could orbit the Earth. But in those years, the Kremlin only wanted warheads. So Korolev bit his tongue and built the missile, knowing it could become something more. The R-7 did not just fly. It was a controlled explosion that could hurl 5 metric tons across 6,000 miles. To understand the violence, imagine the rocket's engines burning enough kerosene and liquid oxygen per second to fill 2 Olympic swimming pools every minute. That is not an exaggeration. The vehicle stood as tall as a 10-story building, shaking the ground for miles. On paper, it could hit New York, Washington, or Chicago less than half an hour after launch. Your city would have no warning. In May of 1957, the first test rocket lifted off from a secret pad in Kazakhstan. It lasted 98 seconds before bursting into a fireball. The second attempt in July also failed. Engineers found molten metal inside the engines. The problem was in the engine's fuel lines. They had to redesign a valve while the whole country waited. Korolev and his team worked day and night, sleeping under their desks. On August 21st, 1957, the third R-7 roared into the sky. This time, the missile did not tear itself apart. It streaked across the Soviet Union, its dummy warhead crashing into the Pacific test range 4,000 miles away. For the first time, a man-made object had traveled between continents in under an hour. The Soviet military declared victory. They had an intercontinental ballistic missile. Your world now lived in a new, terrifying balance, or imbalance. The Central Intelligence Agency had been tracking the R-7's development, but they assumed it would take years to work, just days before the successful test. An American analyst wrote that the Russians were at least 5 years behind. You can read that report today in declassified archives. It was wrong. The gap was 0. The missile had arrived, and nobody in the West knew yet. Meanwhile, inside Korolev's bureau, a separate team had been quietly designing a satellite. An engineer named Mikhail Tikhonravov had first sketched the concept in 1954. He called it Object PS, which stands for the simplest satellite. It was a polished metal ball 58 centimeters across. Inside, it carried a radio transmitter and 3 batteries. It would broadcast a simple telemetry tone that any ham radio operator could pick up. It weighed just 83 kilograms. That is less than a large man. But to put it in orbit, they needed to modify the R-7. They removed the heavy warhead and its guidance system. They replaced the nose cone with a lightweight fairing. They added a small satellite and a new upper stage. The altered rocket was renamed Sputnik PS, but it was still fundamentally an R-7 missile. Every bolt that once aimed at a city now aimed at the stars. The deadline was brutal. Korolev had to persuade Nikita Khrushchev, a man whose temper was legendary. Khrushchev wanted it launched before the American Vanguard project, which was set for early 1958. The test success was on August 21st. The satellite launch was originally scheduled for October 6th, but they moved it forward. The actual date was October 4th, 1957. That gave them 44 days. In those 6 weeks, Korolev's engineers worked without rest. They tested the modified rocket on the ground, replaced faulty parts, and argued with military officers who still wanted to shoot it as a weapon. A historian named Asif Siddiqui, who studied the original Kremlin memos, found that the military initially refused to release a second R-7 rocket for a satellite. They wanted it for another missile test. Only a direct order from Khrushchev broke the deadlock. The satellite almost did not happen. On the afternoon of October 4th, a technician noticed a tiny defect in the rocket's electrical system. They fixed it with minutes to spare. As the sun dipped below the Kazakh steppe, the floodlights blazed on the towering white rocket. Hundreds of soldiers and scientists clustered at a safe distance. Korolev himself gave the final go from a bunker. The engines ignited. Slowly, the R-7 lifted off the pad, its orange flames turning night into day. It rose for a full 10 seconds, then accelerated, pressing its own weight against the sky. And then it tilted, arcing toward the north. For 2 minutes, the world below held its breath. In the bunker, engineers stared at telemetry dials as if reading a sacred text. If it failed, the Soviet Union might still launch a satellite later, but the magic of that moment might be lost. But it did not fail. The upper stage separated perfectly. The little sphere popped free. It began beeping. The beep was a raw, unmodulated pulse. 2 short blips, a pause, then 2 more. It sounded like a heartbeat from an alien world. When Korolev heard that beep over the radio, he allowed himself a rare smile. The next morning, the beep was all over the news. In America, radio hosts played it on a loop. People went outside and stared up, wondering if that dot was a Soviet eye watching them. The New York Times ran a banner headline: Soviet fires Earth satellite into space. It is circling the globe at 18,000 miles per hour. What they did not say, but what everyone understood, was that the rocket that put it there could just as easily have sent a nuclear warhead. A physicist named James Van Allen, who would later discover the radiation belts that bear his name, told a reporter that the satellite itself was nothing. The important thing was the rocket. He meant the missile. For a brief, shuddering moment, your entire civilization stood on a razor's edge. That same rocket could have sparked World War III if the Americans had misjudged the launch. But instead, its beat became a siren call for wonder. Here lies the great paradox. The R-7 as a weapon was actually a terrible idea. Its massive size required enormous launch pads that could not be hidden. It took nearly a day to fuel because of the liquid oxygen. In a real nuclear war, it would be too slow to survive a first strike. It was a weapon that was almost useless for war. But as a spaceship launcher, those same features made it perfect. The very things that made it a clumsy instrument of death made it a magnificent engine for reaching the stars. This is the inversion that still shapes your life. The descendants of that missile now carry astronauts to the International Space Station. The rocket's design, those 4 conical side boosters in the long central core, proved so reliable that it became the workhorse of the space age. It launched the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. It sent the first probes to the Moon, Venus, and Mars. Over 6 decades, it has flown more than 1,800 missions. That is more than any other orbital rocket in human history. It has a launch success rate of over 97%. In rocketry, that is a mythic number. When you watch a live stream of a crew launch from Kazakhstan, you are seeing the great-grandchild of the R-7. The machine that once aimed at your city now carries people to their dreams. Your phone's GPS relies on a network of satellites. The earliest versions of that network were launched on variants of the R-7. Weather forecasts, television broadcasts, scientific discoveries about our climate. All trace a thread back to that autumn night, 1957. Even the satellite internet you use in a remote cabin owes a debt to the missile race. Nearly every major space technology you touch was midwifed by the same primal fear. A historian named Asif Siddiqui wrote that the space age was not a peaceful project. It was a direct extension of the missile age. But it almost did not happen. The near miss was not just the 44-day scramble. It was that the entire enterprise hung on a single decision by a leader who could have chosen war. It hung on the fragile body of a man who had been broken in a gulag. It hung on a satellite that was almost canceled because the military wanted more bombs. And it hung on a launch that could have destroyed the rocket on the pad, resetting the clock. The next launch window could have been weeks away. The American Vanguard was already on the pad in Florida, preparing for its own try. In a parallel world, Sputnik never beeped. The space age would have been delayed by years, or perhaps launched by a nation more interested in weaponizing space, and the technology you rely on today might not exist or would carry a crueler shadow. But this is the world you live in, the one where the missile turned upward, the one where fear transformed into wonder in just 6 weeks. That transformation took 44 days, but its echoes will last millennia. The one where a giant bomb carrier, the deadliest machine ever built at that moment, birthed the most hopeful journey humanity has ever taken. Tonight, when you see that pinpoint of light gliding through the stars, remember what it really is. It is a machine built to destroy, repurposed in a breath. It is the beat that shook the world, and the silence that followed when we realized we had not perished. It is the ultimate proof that the same tools can either end your world or expand it immeasurably. That light looks exactly like a star, but its story is far stranger, and it belongs to you. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel. A new story every week.